Chapter 6 of The Ghost of Guir House. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Ghost of Guir House by Charles Willing Beale. Chapter 6. It was past midnight and the house quiet, when Paul determined to have another look at the mysterious door at the foot of his closet stairs. He had sat for more than an hour before his bedroom fire, after bidding Ah Ben good night, to make sure that the inmates of Guir House had retired. And as not a sound had been heard since locking his door, he sincerely hoped they were asleep. Before descending into the noisome depths, however, he concluded to climb up into his window and have another look at the beautiful panorama of mountain and woodland shimmering in the meager light of a hazy sky and a moon past full. The uncertain outline of a distant horizon, the interminable stretch of forest which bore away upon every hand, the rugged heights, now soft and colorless, the aromatic smell of pine and fir, the distant murmur of falling water, and the assonant whispering of wind in the tree-tops had all become strangely fascinating to him, more so than such things had ever been before. Never was a house so situated, so lost to the world, so tightly held in the lap of unregenerate nature, thought Paul. No laugh of child, no shout of man, no bark of dog, nor bellowing beast to break the stillness of the midnight air. An impenetrable, imperturbable, and silent wilderness shuts out the busy world, as we know it, forever and ever. It is a fitting place for such witchery as the old man seems master of, and I do not wonder that he has chosen it for his home. But the girl, the poor girl, she must get away. He closed the window and prepared for his descent into the well. Removing his shoes, he put on a pair of soft felt slippers, and then, with candle in his hand, a box of matches and a revolver in his pocket, entered the closet, and opened the scuttle in the floor. A mouldy smell rose upon the air, and Henley recoiled at the thought of what might be in waiting below. He had not the slightest idea of how he should open the door at the bottom, but would make a careful study of the situation, hoping that a solution of the difficulty would present itself. The steps creaked dismally as he placed his weight upon them, and it was necessary to use extreme caution to avoid breaking through the more rotten ones. He had not descended more than a dozen when there was a terrible crash above his head, and he found himself in absolute darkness. The trap had fallen as upon the previous night, he having forgotten to fasten it back, and the wind had blown out his candle. Henley hastened back up the stairs, fearful lest the noise had waked someone in the house, and without relighting his candle threw himself upon the bed to await developments. After listening for some minutes, and hearing nothing, he became convinced that no one had been disturbed, and so, creeping out of bed and lighting his candle by the dying embers in the fireplace, started in afresh. This time he was careful to fasten back the scuttle door, and in doing so discovered that one of the great iron hinges was loose. It was more than 2 feet long, and with very little difficulty he managed to wrench it off, thinking it might possibly be of service in forcing the door at the bottom. He was careful this time to let the scuttle down quietly after him, thinking it safer to do this than to prop it open. The bottom was reached in safety after the usual doleful crunching and creaking of the timber, and Paul sat down on the bottom step with his candle to rest and quiet himself, before proceeding with his work upon the door. A dead stillness reigned all about him, broken only by the occasional resettling of the steps above his head, but which, to his excited brain, was like the report of a pistol. Still even this ceased in a few minutes. and the silence was undisturbed. He now made a careful examination of the door. It was very heavy and solid. Holding his candle close against the crack, he could see, to his surprise, that it was bolted upon the inside. Placing his ear close against the keyhole, he listened, but it was silent as a tomb within, and how the door became fastened upon the inside was inexplicable, unless indeed there was another outlet, which from his examination of the building had seemed improbable. Then, taking out his knife, he stuck it into the wood in various directions to ascertain the condition of its preservation. The door itself was in an excellent state, but in examining the lintel the blade of his knife suddenly sank into the rotten wood up to the handle. Here, then, was the place to begin operations, and fortunately it was on the side from which the door opened. Henley had soon dug away a great segment of decayed wood, exposing the bolt clearly to view. Then, taking the hinge which he had brought with him, and slipping the small end between the bolt and the frame of the door, he used it as a lever to pry against the bolt within. The iron was so old and rusty, and his purchase so poor, that he only succeeded in making a rasping sound where the two metals scraped against each other, and so stopped, discouraged. Presently he bethought him of his handkerchief, which he wrapped carefully around the end of the hinge, and thus not only gained a better purchase, increasing his leverage, but was able to operate without the slightest sound. It was a long time before the bolt moved, but to his intense gratification it did move at last, and Henley took a fresh grip upon his hinge. Backward and forward he worked his lever, and with each turn the old bolt slipped back a little. At last he could see the end of it, and then it was clear of the frame entirely. He had expected no difficulty in opening the door when the hinge was once slipped, but to his surprise it was still immovable. He pulled and tugged and pushed, but it would not budge. Then suddenly, just as he was about to give up, it came tumbling down upon him, so that he was barely able to save it from falling against the stairs with a terrible crash, but fortunately caught it upon his shoulder, and lowered it to the floor without a sound. Imagine his surprise in going to what he now believed to be the open portal, to find that the doorway had been bricked up from within, and that the door itself had simply been the back of a solid wall. Naturally he was disappointed at finding himself no nearer the inner chamber than before. A careful examination of the masonry showed that the work of bricking up the entrance had undoubtedly been done from the other side, and after the door had been closed and bolted. This was evidenced from the fact that there was no mortar next the door, against the smooth inner surface of which the bricks had been closely laid. Henley worked his hinge between some of the looser joints, and found, just as he expected, that the mortar had been laid from within. By degrees he managed to wedge one of the bricks out of its place, and then pulled it bodily from the wall. The inner surface was plastered over. He tried another, which he got out more easily, and it told the same tale. Then he went to work in earnest, and had soon dug a hole large enough to admit his body. Leaning over into the aperture, with his candle at arm's length, the place looked dark and empty, with faint masses of lighter shadow. Then, with a certain indescribable awe, Henley commenced crawling through the breach. Stepping upon an earthen floor, he found himself in a vault-like chamber, damp, mouldy, and foul of atmosphere. He glanced hurriedly about, and then turned to examine the wall through which he had come. Just as he had surmised, the bricks had been laid from the inner side, and plastered over within. The person who had done the work must have had some other means of escape. This set him to wondering where the other entrance could be, and to a careful search around the wall. But there was no door, no window, nor opening of any kind. How had the work been done? While he was wondering, he stumbled over something in the floor, and, recovering, threw back his head, holding his candle high above it. He was startled by the sight of what appeared to be 4 shadowy human faces, looking directly at him from above. Instinctively he sought his revolver, but before drawing it, perceived that what he had taken for living people were simply 4 portraits of the most remarkable character he had ever beheld. Paul stared in bewilderment at the sight before him. The pictures were so old, their canvases so rotten and mildewed and stained with the accumulated fungi of time and darkness, that it was only by degrees that the intention of the artist became manifest. In the hall and other apartments of the old house, Henley thought he had seen the most original and inexplicable pictures ever painted, but here, buried forever from the sight of human eyes, were the most dreadful countenances ever transcribed from life or the imagination of man. Torture was clearly depicted upon each face, but not torture alone, for horror, fright, and mental agony were strangely blended in each. Not a face that looked down upon him from those antiquated frames but bore that agonized, heartbroken, terrified expression. Paul was paralyzed. A kind of mesmeric spell held him to the spot, so that he could not remove his eyes from the uncanny scene before him. Then a wild desire to be rid of the place forever seized him, and he stepped backward. At the same minute he observed for the first time what looked like some faded letters painted upon the wall directly beneath the 4 mysterious portraits. Examining these with his candle, he saw that they formed the words, "The last of the Guirs." "No wonder Dorothy said that she was afraid of them," Paul reflected. "Their portraits alone would drive me mad." He took another long searching look, and as his eyes grew accustomed to the faded coloring, he observed how cleverly the work had been done. Evidently the pictures had been painted from life, though under what circumstances Henley could never imagine. The faces were all those of a feminine type; they were of young women, apparently but little more than girls, and each with this lifelike, though dreadful expression. As Paul stood marveling and wondering, a new interest seized him. At first he could not quite understand what it was, but it became stronger and better defined, he knew, for he recognized one of the faces. Yes, there could be no mistake about it. The picture on the left was a portrait of Dorothy herself. Henley rubbed his eyes and looked again and again. He could not believe their evidence, but they had not deceived him. He tried to make himself believe that it was the likeness of some ancestor to whom she had a strange resemblance; but, despite the look of pain, it could be no other than Dorothy, and indeed this very expression helped to heighten the likeness, for had he not seen a similar expression at the breakfast table? The longer he gazed at it, the more convinced he became that this was a portrait of Miss Guir. At last, thoroughly mystified, he turned away, intending to leave this gruesome chamber of horrors forever. But now, for the first time, the heap of rubbish in the center of the floor engaged his attention. Taking his hinge, he stirred up the mass. Some shreds of cloth, which fell to pieces on being touched, and beneath them some human bones. This was all, but it was enough, and overwhelmed with horror, Henley rushed out of the room, bounding through the aperture he had made in the wall, and up the rickety stairs into his own bedchamber. He carefully closed the scuttle, heaped some firewood upon it, shut the closet door, and fastened it securely from without. He then built up a roaring fire, lit another candle, and sat meditating over what he had seen until the dawn of day. When the light of the sun came streaming into his room, he undressed and went to bed. Whatever may have been Mr. Henley's suspicions concerning the implication of the Guirs with the crime which he could no longer doubt had been committed in their house, they were promptly dispelled, so far as the young lady was concerned, upon meeting Dorothy at the breakfast table. Her innocent though serious face was a direct rebuke to any distrust he might have entertained, and he even doubted if she had any knowledge of the state of things he had discovered in the vault. This, of course, only added to the mystery, nor was Mr. Henley's self-esteem fortified by the memory of how unscrupulously he had become the guest of these people, and of how equivocal had been his treatment of their hospitality. All this, however, related to the past, and, as he felt, could not be now undone. He must act to the best of his ability in the extraordinary position in which he found himself. After breakfast they walked again into the garden, and while Paul smoked his cigarette, meditatively, Dorothy gathered flowers for the house. There was an earnestness in everything that she did, quite unusual in a girl of her age, and at times her manner was grave and sad, but strangely attractive, nevertheless. When she had completed her labors in the garden, she came and seated herself beside him. "Some day, Paul, we'll have a cheerier home than this, won't we?" she said, looking wistfully up at the quaint old pile before them. "I don't think we could have a more romantic one," he answered, and then, hoping to elicit an explanatory answer, added, "But why should Guir House not seem cheerful to you?" "I don't know, it has always been gloomy. Don't you think so?" "Not having known it always, Dorothy, I am not in a position to judge, but it will always be the sweetest place on earth to me, because I met you here for the first time." "Yes, I know, but you must not forget your promise." She seemed nervous and anxious concerning his fulfillment of it. "And do you suppose that I could ever forget anything you asked me? No, Dorothy, while you will it, I am your slave, but as I told you before, you exert such a strange power over me that you could make me hate and fear you. I don't know why this should be so, but I feel it." "Hush!" she said, extending her outstretched hand toward his mouth. "Do not talk in that way. You frighten me. For, oh, Paul, I was just beginning to hope that in you I had found a friend who would never shrink away from me. Do not tell me that you will ever become afraid of me like the others. I could not bear it." "I shrink? God forbid!" he answered. "But tell me, why are other people afraid of you? You mystify me." "Because I am different, so different from them." "I'm quite sure of that," he replied, "else I should never have come to love you within an hour of meeting you." She did not smile. She did not even look up at him, but sat gazing at nothing, with countenance as solemn and imperturbable as that of a sphinx. "How am I ever to understand you, Dorothy? You seem such a riddle," said Paul presently. "You will never understand me," she answered with a sigh. "No one ever has understood me, and you will be just like the rest." "But you will never let me be afraid of you like the others, will you?" he exclaimed half in earnest. "I don't know. Others are. Why should not you be?" She was still staring into vacancy, with her hands clasped, and Paul thought he detected a little, just a little, of the same expression he had seen in the portrait. He started, and Dorothy saw him. "What is the matter?" she inquired, looking around at him for the first time. "Nothing. Only you looked so dreadfully in earnest you startled me." "But surely you would not be startled by so simple a thing as that." "Why not? I am only human," he answered. "Yes, but I am sure there was something else. Now tell me, was there not?" "Why, how strangely you talk," he replied, searching her face for an explanation. "Of course there wasn't. Why should there be?" She leaned back, apparently still in doubt as to his assertion, while her countenance grew even more grave than before. Henley was puzzled, and while Dorothy had not ceased to charm him, he was conscious of a very slight uneasiness in her presence. This, however, wore off a little later when they went together for a stroll in the forest. The girl's extreme delicacy of appearance, her abstracted, melancholy manner, and sincerity of expression both attracted and perplexed Paul, and kept him constantly at work endeavoring to solve her character and form some conception of the mystery of her life. He had not yet had even the courage to ask her if Ah Ben were her father, dreading to expose himself as an impostor and be ordered from the place, which, despite his discovery of the previous night, he could only regard as an unmitigated hardship in the present state of his feelings. And so he had let the hours slip by, constantly hoping that something would occur to explain the whole situation to him. And yet nothing had occurred, and now upon the third day he was as grossly ignorant of the causes which had produced his strange environment as at the moment of his arrival. "One thing I do not understand," Paul observed as they wandered over the vari-colored leaves, side by side. "It is why you should be so anxious to leave this ideal spot." "Have I not told you that it is because I am out of my element, because I am avoided, because I have not a friend far nor near? Oh, Paul, do you not know what it is to be alone in the world?" "And do you believe that a simple change of locality would alter all this?" he asked. She paused for a moment before answering, and then, looking down upon the ground, said, as if with some effort, "No, not that alone." "What then, Dorothy?" he asked with solicitude. "I have already told you," she replied without looking up. "Oh, Paul, what a short memory you must have!" "Of course I understand that we are to be married," he responded hastily, "but how can that alter the situation? Dorothy, if we have not found congenial friends in that position in life in which God or nature has placed us, how can we hope to make them in another? Do you not think there may be some deeper reason than simple locality and single blessedness? Would it not be natural to look for the cause in the individual?" "Undoubtedly you are right," she answered, "but your premises do not apply to my case, for neither God nor nature ever intended that I should live this life. Oh, Paul, believe me when I tell you that I know whereof I speak. Do not judge me as you would another. Some day you may know, but I cannot tell you now." She spoke pleadingly, as imploring to be released from some awful incubus which it was impossible to explain. Paul listened in deep perplexity, and swore that the powers of heaven and earth should never come between them. So different was she from any girl that he had ever seen that her very eccentricity bound him to her with a magic spell. when he had again asked her if Ah Ben would oppose their marriage, or indeed if anyone else would, she declared that no human being would raise a voice against it. "Then what is to hinder us?" he asked. "I am poor, but I can support you. Not, perhaps, in such luxury as you are accustomed to, but I can give you a home. And if you are so unhappy here, why submit to unnecessary delay?" He had become impassioned and enthused by the girl's strange influence over him. "True, Paul, there are none to hinder us," she replied seriously. "That is, no one but—" She paused, not knowing how to proceed. "Then there is some one," cried Paul earnestly. "I thought as much. Who might the gentleman be?" "Yourself!" exclaimed Dorothy, her eyes still fixed upon the ground. "Myself?" shouted he in amazement. "Do you mean to say that I should oppose my own marriage with the girl I love?" "You might," she answered demurely, casting a side glance up at him, and allowing the very faintest, saddest kind of smile to rest for an instant upon her face. "Well," said Paul, "I do not suppose you will explain what you mean, but it would be only natural that I should like to know." "I only mean," she replied, resuming her meditative attitude, "that you do not know me, that you neither know who nor what I am. If I did not love you, I might deceive and entrap you, but not under the circumstances." Later they returned to the house. Chapter 7. Roger Melin.